go. Good morning, everybody. So we're going to be throwing a lot of facts and figures at y'all this morning, and I'm going to focus our next session on one that we just heard in the last conversation, and it's this, that Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death for Americans. Of the top 10, it is the only one with no way to prevent it, no way to slow it down, no way to stop it from developing in the first place. So we're joined by a great panel to talk about this, Laurie Ryan and Richard Mohs. And I'd like to throw this question to both of you. The big wide open question, Laurie, let me maybe start with you. Why has Alzheimer's proven so tough to crack?
Well, you know, Alzheimer's is a very complex disease, and that's one of the things we've really discovered, I think, over especially in the last decade, is that there's multiple different sort of risks that get you to Alzheimer's at the end of the day, and your risk might be different than mine. Mine might be cardiovascular, yours might be genetic. So trying to untangle all of that has proven very difficult, and so it's likely that we're going to need treatments that are probably going to be different for different individuals. So a little more on the sort of precision medicine is what you've heard from cancer and things like that, but ultimately trying to identify what the risk factors are and then trying to, actually attack those for different people.
But that would also be true, obviously, of cancer, a complex
True, although
disease
cancer,
which we don't fully understand,
correct.
But there are many drugs on the market.
Cancer started a little bit before, if you think about the war on cancer, started in the 1970s. So Alzheimer's, the Centers program that the NIA funds started in the mid-80s. So we're a bit behind in terms of where we've had the research effort, so
and
the
In
establishment.
the scientific community.
Yeah, so the real focus has come a little bit later than it started with cancer, I think.
Richard, this is something at Eli Lilly y'all have been focused on since the 70s.
Yes, I think it's important to understand that until relatively recently, many people didn't think of Alzheimer's as really a disease. I mean, Alzheimer's original patient was a lady who had a very young onset, and of course, when it happens in the 50s or 40s, people clearly identified it as a disease. But for a lot of people, including in the medical community, probably until the late 70s or 80s, they thought this was an inevitable process of normal aging, and there's really no way to intervene there. But beginning like in the 70s and in the 80s, we began to understand that it has a specific pathology. There's a biochemical abnormality that starts to go on. There's certain high-risk groups that have genetic abnormalities, and that opened up the opportunity for a company like Lilly in the mid-70s to begin to try to develop a pharmacology that would intervene and slow that process, which in some people is clearly abnormal. So we've been late to the game, but now we have the tools, we have the scientific basis that allows companies like Lilly to think that we can eventually have a medical impact on this disease that will be real and meaningful for patients.
Yeah, we're talking about this period in the 70s and 80s when finally research, attention, and money started flowing in. Drug after drug after drug looked promising in the early stages and then flailed in clinical trials, and in some cases was shown to accelerate Alzheimer's. Is the basic issue, I mean, we know, we have some insight into what causes Alzheimer's, these plaques that form in the brain and choke off neurons. Is the problem that the drugs that attack that then also attack harmful functions? That's what we're constantly grappling with here?
Well, I think in the case, since I was responsible for one of those drugs, which we thought was very promising and was found to actually make patients worse.
Name the drug for us.
That was semaglutide. The results of those studies have been published. A couple of things about that. One is what we now believe is that the drug was having effects which we didn't understand when we first introduced it into patients, and those were causing the adverse events. But it's important to understand when we go into a new area that, as Laurie mentioned, is highly complex, we have to learn as we go along. And each new effort to develop an intervention that goes into patients that has a specific effect, if it doesn't work, that closes that avenue off and directs our efforts towards something else. And over time, we get better. And I think what we're seeing now is we're beginning to see a few compounds that have fairly specific effects that seem to be a little bit positive. And I'm sure that will ultimately lead to better efforts to go in that pathway, find complementary things. So I don't think we should view failures really as failures of the scientific process. The process is working. It's moving us in the right direction, but we're going to have a lot of dead ends along the way that we have to work through.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. We learn from the trials, and they're not failed trials if we can understand why things didn't work or what the pathology is, things that we didn't know before. So absolutely, we have to test the drugs, and this is the way it has to be, and it has to be a systematic process. That's the way science works. And so everybody would like things to happen very, very fast, but unfortunately, we've got to actually do due diligence in the drugs.
And go through all the trials. Well,
Right.
bring us up to speed on what the landscape looks like now, because we are hearing what may be the glimmers of promise that we are maybe turning a corner. Give us a sense of what are the most promising things in development right now?
So, at the NIH, we fund a lot. We fund both basic science. We do a lot of the basic work that goes into the discovery process, but then we also do fund some trials and things. And we actually partner a lot with companies like Lilly that we are co-funding some of these large trials, trying to leverage all of our resources. So I think there's a large landscape at the NIH that we look at. So the anti-amyloid drugs, like the Lilly drugs, are certainly one piece. And they're very exciting, I think, now because we've realized that we do have to go earlier, as you heard, I think, Harry say in the other segment, that you have to go earlier. We know the changes occur, a decade or
introducing
more.
these drugs to patients
Exactly.
far
So
earlier
part of
in the
what's going
process.
on with these drugs now is that they're going into pre-symptomatic. So people who have risk factors like high levels of amyloid on the brain or genetic risk, but who do not have dementia currently. And if you intervene then, can we slow the process? So that, again, is something that's being tested right now. And that is very exciting to be able to go earlier. Until we had, the PET scans that could show amyloid on the brain and things, we were not able to see these changes occurring early. So now we have ways to actually identify it earlier. So it's been very helpful, and I think these trials that are looking at pre-symptomatic disease are extremely important and will be telling us if we can have an effect.
Flesh this out a little bit for us.
Yeah, I think
Richard.
that the amyloid-related or the A-beta-related compounds are the most advanced, and they come from a lot of work that was supported by the NIH and private funders, including the Alzheimer's Association, that identified these biochemical pathways that lead to the amyloid plaques. And so the pharmacology around that largely comes through the pharmaceutical industry, but it's building upon those advances. And those are the kind of the leading edge. Along with that, we've developed these tools that allow us to identify people who have deposited plaque, as Harry mentioned, way before they develop symptoms. That suggests that
10,
we should...
15 years before
10,
that.
15 years, you start, it's like if you get atherosclerotic plaques a long time before you get a heart attack, you get amyloid plaques in the brain a long time before you get dementia. That looks like we need to move those clinical trials earlier, so we're learning on the diagnostic side, on the therapeutic side. And beyond that, we have other aspects of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease which are less well understood and haven't really led to pharmacology yet, but that includes tau, these tangles that grow within neurons. There's ApoE, which is one of the well-known risk factors for common disease. There's no pharmacology around that, but I assume over time we'll develop other pharmacology approaches to this disease that will improve it.
Let me stop you for a minute on this idea of testing people. Any of the three of us could be 10 or 15 years away from being symptomatic of Alzheimer's. Specifically, what kind of tests are we talking that you're working on? I was reading a headline this morning, saliva tests may look promising in terms of starting to identify genetic markers for some of these. What else is actually
Well,
in
I think
pipeline?
as we were mentioning, the PET scan has really been a turning point that we can actually image amyloid in the brain. Yes, we're always looking for things that are a little less invasive. That work is ongoing. That's much more difficult, but we can actually see amyloid buildup in the brain earlier on, and you can scan people and say, we know that because you have high levels of amyloid, you're at risk. Now, you're not necessarily going to get Alzheimer's, but it puts you at increased risk. So those are the individuals, for example, that are going into the A4 trial. Older adults, high levels of amyloid, but are cognitively normal, so they don't have dementia. Can we get in there with, solanezumab, the drug that Lilly does, and see if we can slow that trajectory into dementia? Can we stop it?
Is the idea that these tests would, somewhere down the road, become part of an annual physical? How are you identifying what do you test everybody? Is that the goal?
Well, I think there's a lot of discussion. The best test, the one that convinces people the most is, as Laurie mentioned, the brain scan that detects amyloid, because this is essentially allows you to do in a living person what we used to only be able to do after a person died, see the pathology of the disease. The trouble with that is it's sort of invasive, it's pretty expensive. I'm not sure that anybody would want to do that. So there's a lot of efforts ongoing to find less invasive, less expensive ways of identifying people who might be candidates to get that sort of scan so that you don't overuse those sorts of scans. And there's a lot of work of that sort going on that would be, say, blood tests or even cognitive screens that would be helpful.
Family history presumably is a factor in there. Yeah, okay. Do, as you look at the spectrum of drugs and possibilities and research out there, is it correct to say we're not likely to come up with some miracle drug, silver bullet for this? That Alzheimer's, as you mentioned, is a complicated disease, and probably preventing, curing it, slowing it is going to involve all kinds of different therapies that may be very different from patient to patient.
I think that's true. I mean, I think, obviously amyloid, as Richard mentioned, is one of the main players that we're looking at, but there are other, maybe even adjunctive pieces. We know, for example, I'm going to touch on lifestyle interventions, that they don't cure, prevent Alzheimer's, but they can certainly help you and they can delay when you might get the disease. So having a healthy diet, a healthy lifestyle, those are things that we can sort of do for people now. And additionally, look at these other potential disease targets. I mean, as you said, there's not pharmacology around them now in terms of drugs, but people are working on these novel targets and they're looking at ways that we can intervene. But I think that's true, is that there are going to be unique characteristics, different risk profiles for different individuals. That means you're going to get maybe a different set of drugs or recommendations, interventions for you that I might not get, for
And
example.
as you look at the landscape and you're trying to figure out at the NIH who to partner with, where to prioritize funding dollars, are you looking, how do you distinguish in terms of prioritizing between, say, a drug that will prevent Alzheimer's or slow it once it's already manifested itself?
Well, the way the NIH funds research is that we have a very strict process. We have a peer-reviewed process. So applications come in for funding, they get reviewed by peers, by the community, the research community, and then based on how they score, NIH then can make funding decisions. So we get the benefit of having the input from the research community as well to help make those decisions, to see which things look the most promising. And so we utilize that information, but obviously, a lot of what NIH does is very basic research. We do, but we also do what we call translational, moving sort of from the basic science to identify new targets to get us into early stage, maybe clinical development, clinical intervention. So we actually do run the whole gamut, but a lot of where the bulk of our money goes is in the basic science discoveries that then other people use, like the pharmaceutical companies, to take it further.
Yeah, well, to look at where the future might go, this is a complex disease. I don't think we'll have one treatment that will satisfy all, but as we move toward treatments that would slow the underlying pathology of the disease, once those would be introduced in combination with, say, lifestyle things that may also have a key role to play, just like in diabetes, you have the disease, the drugs, but you also have to keep your lifestyle in check, et cetera. What we would see from a public health point of view is down the road, I don't think we'll see the disease disappear, at least not in my lifetime, but what you would hope to see is the risk for people at a given age for actually developing dementia and the accompanying disability will start to go down. The way we see rates of heart attack and stroke have gone down with the better control of cholesterol and blood pressure and so forth.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds as though one of the things that's really changed in the last few years is recognition of the importance of early detection, early treatment. Is that, I mean, when we talk about, because we are seeing headlines every day of glimmers of promise, and that maybe there is some, that when we hold this conference 2 years from now, we'll be able to say, actually, there is a drug that helps prevent it. Is it the early detection that's been the pivotal change?
I think, I'll let Laurie talk too, but this has been incredibly important. We always talked about the mantra of early detection, but the work of, say, the Diane study, which are these people who have the genetically determined form of the disease, where in those people we know now for absolute certainty that the pathology begins 15 or more years before they actually develop symptoms. And we've been able to map out that trajectory in these courageous families where the disease is determined by a single gene mutation. And it turns out that that's probably the case in the more garden variety disease. And that just provides absolute certainty based on data that that is where we need to go.
Is it a challenge finding enough people to sign up for these clinical trials? People who are relatively young and not showing any symptoms?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder because we have to screen a lot of people to identify people who are at risk. But you would be surprised that people are very worried about Alzheimer's disease. People are very fearful of it. And and you can understand why. It's not just that you end up, something that will cause death, but causes great disability and burden for the participant, the person, but also the family member. So people are worried, and people are very anxious to actually participate. We've been very encouraged by that. It's just that the screening process is very intense for these prevention trials, making sure we have people who do have that level of risk. So I think it's challenging, but heartening that people are really interested in volunteering, and we can't do it without the volunteers. Absolutely not. Without the volunteers, and their families are critical.
I mean, when you talk to people, as we've seen with many people in this room, if you've watched a relative or somebody you know go through the disease, it's a great motivator to not want that to happen to your children or whatever.
Right.
So that is what really gets people's interest. And you see in families where they've had 2 or 3 cases in the same family, oftentimes there's a lot of fear in the family as to what's going to happen down the road. But it's also a great motivator to get people interested in clinical trials and to support the kind of work that the NIA is doing.
One thing I want to touch on just briefly is that Alzheimer's occurs at a greater rate in women than in men, a greater rate in African American population than white. Is that helpful as you are, not helpful obviously in terms of people getting it, but helpful as you try to identify what is going to stop this, to be able to study those different populations, that it manifests itself differently?
It's
in different
critical.
groups?
It's actually critical to understand the different groups and the populations and things we don't. We know one of the reasons for women is that women live longer, but it looks like there's some research to suggest that's not necessarily the only factor that's going on with women. With people, African Americans, Hispanics, some of the issues are related to health disparities, for example, and when you get seen by a doctor and whether or not your cardiovascular disease has been taken care of. So it's critically important to understand what's happening with diverse, populations as well. It is critical to understanding the disease, for sure.
We've been talking about priorities. Talk to me about the priorities. Are we getting the funding right in terms of, we're talking about cutting edge research to find a cure. There's the whole flip side of the coin of providing for long-term care and assisting people who are afflicted by this disease and the people who are trying to take care of them. From the federal government's point of view, how do you strike that balance?
So at the NIH, our total focus is on research. So for us, our mission is public health and finding ways to intervene and with basic science or even doing clinical trials that are going to advance public health. So I think we come at it from a different perspective. Different aspects of the federal government have other challenges. So for us, it is a research mission, and so we have to realize that. But equally, care is also, of course, extremely important. And people mentioned, family members. Well, my father has Alzheimer's disease, and he's 92 now, so he's still doing pretty well. But so it's a challenge. So I have it on a personal level, and I'm also his primary caregiver. So I can certainly see the challenges of caring. So I think both aspects are critically important, and it is a challenge, to whether to strike the balance. But luckily, I think we have a lot of good people in policy that are trying to figure that out.
Well, look, since I work in a for-profit company, we try to identify areas where there's a high unmet medical need, but the science has advanced to the point where at least we can imagine that there's eventually going to be a medicine that we can produce there. So our focus is on the medicines and the diagnostic tools that go with them. But we're well aware from our clinical trials and our interactions with physicians that if there isn't the appropriate incentives for them to make the diagnosis, if there isn't the appropriate caregiving systems in place for families to take care of these patients, the medicines will never be used. So all that has to go together.
Okay. I'd love to open it up to questions now. If you put your hand up, I think, do we have mics going around back in the back? Anybody with a question on where the research is going, some of the headlines we're reading this week in terms of different tests in early phases? Yes, ma'am, right here in the front. And if you just wait 1 second, we'll bring this microphone over to you.
Thank you for coming here today. My question has to do with misdiagnosis of Alzheimer's in patients. Can you comment on that sometimes mini brain strokes wipe out tissues and then doctors just characterizing this as Alzheimer's, and I'm just trying to understand how we can better make that diagnosis. for proper treatment?
Well, I can just
Or-
give you a first comment. We need to understand there's a difference between dementia, which is the syndrome of having cognitive loss, which is progressive over time, and Alzheimer's disease, which is dementia in the context of a particular kind of biological abnormality. Now, good clinicians, and we probably don't have as many of them as we need, if they do a careful exam, they can usually get it right. But there are a lot of times when the clinical picture is not very clear, and you can make two kinds of errors. One is we don't want to make an error where we diagnose somebody as being demented when they're really not. It's just normal forgetfulness and it's not going to be progressive. That's a bad thing. Or you don't want to misdiagnose somebody as Alzheimer's disease when they've got some other condition, say multiple strokes. And I think the new diagnostic tools that are being developed, like the PET scans and so forth, are helping us to make advances there, but it's still an area of some concern.
Another one? Yes, sir.
We heard from Harry Johns, I think very articulately, some of the work that's being done both here in town and around the world on this disease. Since this is an ideas forum, I'd like your thoughts on what's the biggest shortage right now, ideas or funding?
Well, I'll try to take that. I think we've moved into an era where we have a lot of good ideas. I mean, look, I keep saying, I work for a company that we have to make a profit. We have shareholders. We don't go into an area where we don't think there's the possibility of progress, of actually producing a medicine. We have, in my company, we have plenty of people working on diabetes and cancer and heart disease, and they all think they got great ideas and they'd like to take all the money and have it spent there. But we tend to win some of those arguments. We've kept the company in the business for 27 years. I'm not a fan of just throwing money at things where it can't be well spent, but I think if you looked into the NIA's portfolio or the portfolio of grants that the Alzheimer's Association has, there's a lot of very potentially productive science there that is currently not funded.
I want to follow up on that. You've mentioned a couple times you work at a for-profit company. Mm-hmm. How much is the first drug that works, that's shown to prevent Alzheimer's, mm-hmm. or at least slow its progression, how much is that worth? How many billions?
I actually don't work in that part of the business. I don't know. I think we have to assume. You just don't want to move share prices. I think we have to assume that it's going to be worth something. Otherwise, we spend a lot of time, and I might have to look for another job. But if you look at other therapeutic areas that have blossomed once the path is worn, if you look, for example, say in depression, at serotonin reuptake, once that path was found that you could treat depression through SSRIs, lots of companies developed them. And eventually now they're almost all generic and they're looking for something new to do. If you look at heart disease, once they found out that cholesterol was a big risk factor, lots of companies developed drugs to lower cholesterol and raise HDL, et cetera. And now that era is kind of, most of those are generic, and they're looking for the next thing to sort of up the game. And that's the way I think it's going to go. I think there'll be, there has to be, to keep companies involved, there has to be some reward. In other words, we have to be willing to pay for new things. But that's how we get generics. In the end, is you get new things and they live to their end, and then you have to develop something new. So.
There you go. Another question.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am. We've got. You've got one in the back?
Back in the back.
We'll come to you next. Okay.
Yes, my question relates to the type of research that's being done. I know that I look at these sites where they talk about clinical trials, and it seems like most of them are focused on testing drugs. And I'm wondering, when you talk about lifestyle changes and other things, why don't we see more studies that are focused on changes in lifestyle, particularly with children of people with Alzheimer's or others who are trying to look at how not to get it? If those are other viable options, it just seems everything is about testing different types of drugs.
So I think I can take that, because obviously for lifestyle interventions, they're not exactly profitable for a company. You can't patent that. So, but the NIH does support, and we have a number of trials, and they're actually listed in clinicaltrials.gov, and actually on the NIA's has an Alzheimer's basically information web page called ADIR. You can find it. So we are supporting a number of trials that look at both dietary interventions, cognitive training, as well as exercise. So we are absolutely very interested in that. Again, we don't think that that's necessarily going to be the thing that's going to stop or slow progression, but it is probably something we're going to need to add to whatever we're doing with drugs for individuals. As Richard said, lifestyle is extremely important for cardiovascular risk, diet, exercise. So we are doing those trials. The
Is there
NIH is
any hard
supporting them.
research that shows how much of a difference that makes
You know,
specific to Alzheimer's?
No,
and
I mean,
onset?
there's a lot of work that's been done in animals and things that suggest that. There's a lot of observational studies that say that people who live a healthy lifestyle, it looks like their age of onset of disease is much later. So there's those observational studies, which is why we have to do the clinical trials now, and they actually are underway. And looking for volunteers, I might add, so.
Okay, step on up.
Yeah.
And I think we had a question right here. This lady in the gray suit, if we can get a microphone here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
You've mentioned cardiovascular disease a couple times. Is there a relationship between the disease and Alzheimer's?
Yeah, well, it's not quite clear. There are vascular changes in the brain that can cause small strokes that can contribute to dementia, and the brain, like any organ, can have multiple kinds of pathology. So we often see people who have both some cerebrovascular damage and Alzheimer's disease as well. But I think Laurie may know this better than I. I mean, the connection between the two is not very well established, but you also see things like amyloid deposited around vessels, and we really don't understand that aspect of the disease nearly as well as we should.
Right. I mean, there's data that says that it's a risk factor, right? And for dementia, and as well as, you know, there's some people are trying to understand, is it an amyloid pathology? What is the pathology? But cardiovascular is a risk, diabetes is a risk. So those are things that, while, again, they may not prevent disease, they may allow you to live longer before you end up having a dementia. So those are actually lifestyle factors that we can do something about. You can't do anything about your genetics, but you can make sure you're eating a healthy diet. And those are a lot easier said than done, all of us. I mean, I don't exercise nearly as much as I know I should, given what I know. Right. But so I think it's important to know there are risk factors for sure. We're not saying that if you exercise, you're not going to get Alzheimer's or dementia. Not, but you might be able to extend your healthy period as you age.
Another question. Yep. Yes, ma'am. Right here.
Hi, Bob Marino, Alzheimer's Association, Alzheimer's Impact Movement. Thank you for the excellent dialogue. So my question, and forgive me, I might be putting on the spot a bit, but for so many of us advocating for this, the discussion seems to have turned a path over the past couple of years, emphasizing so much on the early end of things, intervening early, getting therapeutics to folks before they're symptomatic. Is there still a pathway? Are there still therapeutics being looked at for those who are already afflicted, something to offer families who are already dealing with this, which clearly is an elusive target and been a very difficult target?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question.
So, I mean, I'll start because obviously I think you're right. I don't want people to think we're not interested in individuals who have disease or will be getting it, because that's going to continue. And so we are still working. I mean, we do a lot of funding. There are companies that are still looking at intervening at later stages when someone has either mild cognitive impairment, which is, you know, the stage before you get full-blown dementia, or dementia. So there are treatments, things that are looking at some of the behavioral symptoms that occur later in stages of disease, like agitation, psychosis, what we call the neuropsychiatric symptoms. So there is a lot of work still looking at that. And even some, we're funding one that's looking at basically maybe regeneration. Is there a way to actually have cells regrow? So there's a lot of things going on that are still looking at late stages. So it's important, and if we can get something to prevent, that's going to be terrific. It's going to help a lot of people, but we'll still have people who get disease. And so yes, the research is ongoing across the whole disease continuum. Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. That's very important.
Is, as scientists continue to refine drugs that will hopefully prevent it, and maybe our great-grandchildren will never know anyone who's ever had Alzheimer's, is it possible that the same drug, as it continues to be refined, will be of use to somebody who's 5 years, 6 years, 8 years after diagnosis with Alzheimer's? Or are you looking at a totally different category of pharmaceuticals that would address that?
Well, I mean, I think, Richard, you can talk about the way these drugs were first tested.
Yeah, well, I think Laurie's point is quite right. Even if we can slow the progression of the disease and for many patients actually prevent its occurrence, we're still going to, just given the demographics, we're going to have a lot of patients with Alzheimer's disease, and they'll need treatment. And there is work ongoing to try to augment or refine or make better the cholinesterase inhibitors that are now part of the treatment, other neurotransmitter approaches. And I think it's further down the line, but I do think that there is the possibility that if we could slow the degenerative process, the brain still has a capacity for regeneration. I mean, people do regenerate. We grow new synapses. That's how we learn. The synapses grow. If that process could be restored, you could actually imagine somewhere down the road we could get some recovery in patients who the disease has taken hold. If you stop the bad part and augment the good part, you could actually get some recovery. So we know that this is an important avenue to pursue as well as the prevention.
Right.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Heather Foote. I had the opportunity to attend the Alzheimer's disease conference at NIH in February and wondered, coming out of that, what steps you see important to take in terms of diversifying the participants in trials given the effect on particular population sectors of the disease.
Right. No, that's an excellent question. I think the companies
Yeah.
struggle with that as well. How do we reach out and make sure that we're having a diverse population, that everybody's being included in trials? So there are a lot of efforts underway in terms of to enhance recruitment efforts, to enhance outreach efforts. So I'll mention the Us Against Alzheimer's, that George Radenberg's group. They have African American Network Against Alzheimer's. They have Women Against Alzheimer's. So they're actually trying to reach out to make sure that we are including everyone in the trials and not leaving anyone out. So it's very important.
Yeah, just to give you a little bit of an industry perspective, when we develop a new medicine, we usually develop it for use around the world. We would generally not develop a medicine that would be just for people in the US. And many other countries have a requirement that in our late phase clinical trials, we include people from those countries in our trials: Japan, China, European Union, a couple of South American countries. So we of necessity have to go to those countries. But in the US, to get a patient population in your trials that is kind of representative of the patients as a whole is an ongoing struggle, as Laurie mentioned. And it's not unique to Alzheimer's disease. It applies to cancer trials and cardiovascular trials and everything. And it's a constant struggle, and we're always looking for help from groups like Us Against Alzheimer's and NIA and the Alzheimer's Association to help broaden the recruitment network into clinical trials.
That touches on a point we were, right before we came on stage, talking about all of the meetings and gatherings here in Washington this week focused on Alzheimer's. And Richard, you mentioned you were surprised at the number of people attending from Asia, from Japan, from China, from Korea, big numbers of people from the scientific community and others, all focused.
Yes. Well, the aging of the population that we see in the U.S. is actually even amplified in particularly some of the Asian countries, Japan, Korea, et cetera. And so we know this from our own clinical trials. There's a great desire to have new treatments for Alzheimer's disease in virtually all of the countries around the world. And I was just impressed as I walked through the poster sessions at AAIC, how many of the posters were researchers from Korea, Thailand, China, Japan, et cetera, who were coming here to Washington to share their knowledge and their perspective on this disease.
Right. It's a global disease, for sure. It's not just affecting Western countries.
I want to throw one more question in here, which is in terms of having a national plan and harnessing all of the different groups working on this, from the research community to big pharma to universities, government, et cetera. 3 years ago, the Obama administration released a national plan to address Alzheimer's, and the goal was, it struck me as exceedingly ambitious. By 2025, so in 10 years, to be able to prevent and effectively treat Alzheimer's disease. Does that strike you both as realistic, doable, 10 years?
Well, the way we look at it, it's an aspirational goal. We absolutely want to be there by 2025. I think the entire research community.
It's an aspirational goal. It could be the goal by 2017.
No, but I mean, it has to be let me just say, it has to be a little bit realistic as well as aspirational. So yes, we know that's a short timeline. As one of our summit participants said, in drug discovery years, that's like day after tomorrow. Okay, so we understand that it's really going to require a push. And I do think there's a lot of momentum, as you heard Harry talk about, from both the policymakers and the appropriators that this is important and that we need to put the dollars for the research, because we do have to have funding to do the research. So I think everyone gets it. We want to be there at 2025 and are actually striving to get there.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things. I mean, the timeline for drug development is longer than we would like it to be. It's just part of nature, you know. It's about 15 to 20 years from when a compound is first synthesized to when the fastest it could be approved, because it has to go through lots of steps. But I think there's things in the pipeline now that are being tested that they won't cure the disease, but if they slow the progression for at least a few people, that's essentially a cure. I mean, if you take somebody who is 70 years old who would normally have gotten the disease and you can push it out 10 years, I mean, that's almost a cure for many of those folks. And I think what we need to recognize is that this goal essentially is a call to action about how robust does this whole research enterprise have to be in order to have that steady flow of new medicines. And it's got to be higher than it is now. It's just, there's a lot there, but it's not enough to keep the steady flow of new medicines going.
And 2025 won't be the end. We will still be pushing to get more treatments, but that's where we want to have at least something that's going to have an effect on the underlying disease.
All right. Laurie Ryan, Richard Mohs, thank you both.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.